The Supreme Court tells state workers no appropriation, no raise, and the budget impasse goes on. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. I have with me today a couple of State House watchers. Thanks for coming back. Jordan Abudayyeh is here, State House reporter for News Channel 20, WICS in Springfield.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back. And Andy Maloney, State House Bureau Chief for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Welcome.
Good to be here.
And it's a good day for a guy who covers courts particularly, because we're going to start talking about the court decision that one or two state workers care about, I'm guessing. The Supreme Court said that back pay that former Governor Quinn did not pay because the legislature did not appropriate money should not be paid, even though lower courts had said, I guess, that it should, and it's about $2,500 per worker for like $24,000. So where are we, Andy, with that?
Right. So the court, in its decision yesterday, basically sort of cited to three different types of things. They looked at this agreement that was made I think in 2008 and was supposed to go for 4 years, and said, well, the contract itself says it can't supersede law. Now that seems fairly obvious. They also looked at the Illinois Labor Act, the state law that sort of the collective bargaining power is described in, and said that it is subject to appropriation power of the employer. And then the third thing, of course, is that kind of tracks back to the state constitution, which has this clause that says the legislature shall appropriate all expenditures of public funds, right? So you have those three kind of areas working together, and the court saying, well, you know, this isn't terribly novel because the agreement that you signed always said it was subject to appropriation power of the legislature. And so this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise for the state workers, at least in the court's rationale, because when you signed on to this, you were always kind of signing into sort of the whims of the budget process. But for everybody else, I think kind of looking at this, it was interesting because we're kind of in this era where you don't need legislative appropriations to fund
most
state government.
Employees are now being paid on court order,
on
right?
Court order. It's sort of this hodgepodge, and so a court
without an appropriation signed by the governor.
So in this era where we're seeing government being funded mostly by those things, it was interesting that the court kind of came out and in a way gave this endorsement saying that this appropriations clause does in fact still have some teeth.
Where do we go from here?
Well, it's an interesting thing because most people look at the budget situation we're at now and they say, oh, okay, we're funding state government without appropriations. Every time they try and pass an appropriations bill, the governor says there's no money to actually pay for their appropriations. So can this be used as a future excuse? I mean, that's what AFSCME is saying. They're saying the state can go back on their contract with us and they could just claim that the state's broke, we don't have the money, sorry, you don't have an appropriation, we're not going to pass a bill, and then they don't have to honor their contract. And that's what AFSCME is worried about, that the court set a dangerous precedent that way. And especially right now when we are at such a very weird time in state government and so many things are not being passed or are being passed without funding mechanisms, AFSCME is a little bit worried after this.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, I think it was under a lower court ruling that the state is even paying basically state employees under their contracts currently without an appropriation, and that has kept state government moving for these last 9 months and almost 10 months now without a budget in the fiscal year that started July 1st. Is there any chance somebody could go to court again and say, hey, stop payment, and where do we go then?
Well, it's interesting too because the Attorney General in one of those worker pay cases had tried to get sort of that argument to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court explicitly declined to hear the case. And then that was back last summer when this whole impasse sort of got going. So I think it certainly, as AFSCME spokesman Anders Lindahl, I think, said, opens the door to kind of that rationale. And in the lone separate opinion filed by one of the justices, Tom Kilbride, right? He's sort of making this argument as well. He's saying, well, you're talking about the appropriations clause of the Constitution. We also have this thing called the contracts clause that says you can't pass a law that impairs a contract. And to supplement that point and really drive it home, he cited the the state pension reform decision, which was unanimous, which was one of the strongest and most high-profile court decisions in several years, and saying, you said this less than a year ago in this big case where we can't impair contracts. And so when we need to fund state government or get contracts with vendors, people are going to be taking a look at this and saying it's too easy for the state to go back on its promise.
Although I will say, what's interesting is many people thought when Governor Rauner came in and wanted certain demands before he would approve a budget, and the legislature said, no, we're not going to do those things, they're non-budget issues, that the ultimate resolution would come when state employees stopped getting paid. That's the way it was in past years, but it was only the court decisions that kept state employees getting paid this time around that has allowed 90% of state budget to operate, and while 10%, the social service agencies, the universities, higher education in general, are not getting appropriations, not getting payments right now, everything else is going. So if they did stop paying state employees, everybody, including those suburban soccer moms, would see that the state government actually affects them and would perhaps force a resolution, but we don't have that. So I don't know where that goes.
And there's a lot of nuances with that too, because if you remember with state employees, as long as they're still working, there are many of them that still have to get paid under federal law, which of course trumps state law, state constitution. But you're right, it certainly creates a lot of interesting theoretical scenarios.
Okay, well, Andy, you also mentioned the past state Supreme Court decision which struck down pension reform as passed by the legislature under Pat Quinn, which cut back on some of the benefits. And they basically said the Constitution is clear, you can't reduce pensions once promised. That just happened to a case this week involving Chicago pension funds, so that's going to cost the city of Chicago a lot too. Just another indication that local governments and state government are in big trouble, and either more taxes or some kind of future change or cuts is going to be rather drastic to fix it.
Yeah, I talked to a lawyer after that Chicago decision came down, and he said really their best option at this point, after the 3 decisions that the court has handed down, is fund the pension system. There's really a very narrow window for them to actually go in and find some sort of reform. A lot of times people are saying, well, the court left open consideration after that Chicago thing, after the Chicago ruling, so that they could say, well, we can offer you this and you get this benefit in return. That's what consideration is.
In other words, let employees make a choice, and
right.
then it's like a contract.
But the employee has to have a choice, and the state can't force the choice on the employee, but that's that very narrow window. But I think a lot of people are looking at these decisions and saying there really isn't a whole wide-ranging sort of reform deal that we can push, so let's move forward and figure out a way to fund the system and maybe get slight reforms.
Right, and when you, go ahead, Andy.
Oh, I was just going to say, and you're right, they were even more explicit in the Chicago pension decision about sort of the propriety of consideration or basic contract principles, which is, if you fairly bargain for this and you give them a fair choice, there are ways that you can kind of make some changes that might work. But as far as sort of the details of that, we have the governor sort of backing Senate President Cullerton's plan, but it's hard to say whether that is consideration or not, and whether that would follow the principles that the court lays out here. Again, in this decision, it was slightly different than the state case, because in that case, the state said this was an emergency, so we had to sort of cut pensions. In the Chicago case...
And circumvent the Constitution.
Right, exactly.
They admitted that, yeah.
And
Lisa Madigan did.
Right. And in the Chicago case, they were saying, well, no, this isn't a cut. This is a benefit, because we're guaranteeing now that these pensions will be funded, whereas before we really weren't guaranteeing that. And then also, we had a lot of unions in on this deal, so this was fairly bargained for. And those were their 2 arguments. But again, the court said, not so much.
Okay. Jordan, you and I were both at a press conference the governor had at the state fairgrounds this past week. They were talking about setting up a foundation to use private money to improve some buildings. They were in front of a nice backdrop of a really bad roof. But the governor was asked about what appears to many observers to be the losses he took in the last election, a couple of high-profile races. Ken Duncan is a Democrat who sided with the governor on some things, missed some votes that the Democrats really needed, particularly on a bill that would have allowed arbitration to settle the contract with AFSCME, the biggest state employee union. So Duncan kind of took off on Speaker Madigan and said, I'm off the plantation, and well, he only got like 30% of the vote. He lost that race, and there were millions of dollars from Governor Rauner's allies trying to help that Democrat stay in, whereas in the Springfield area, Carlinville area, Republican Sam McCann in the state Senate voted for the arbitration bill. Governor didn't like that, backed Bryce Benton, a state trooper from Springfield, little known before this, although he is on the Convention Center board. And McCann, despite $3 million in advertising and all this negative stuff that was dug up on him or recycled on him from past elections, managed to win. Governor says, we won some primaries elsewhere. I don't see this as a change. The taxpayers lost in those two areas, and he seems to not be changing his strategy at all to try to get a budget where he is critical of the idea that Democrats will just raise taxes, which could pay those pensions, and he's just going forward again, which doesn't seem like it's going to end the impasse.
I think everyone thought the primary would be a turning point, and so that's why...
Not everyone.
A lot of people thought the primary would be a turning point, at least in the way that the governor sort of handled things. If he lost these two very high-profile races, then he would switch gears. Obviously, that's not happening. I think we were watching it because for a year since he was in office, we saw all this money that he had in a pot, and we knew that he was going to use that money to reward or punish people who were going with his agenda.
This is like the $20 million he threw into his own campaign fund,
right,
and another $10 million or so in other campaign funds.
So some of that money and his supporters' money were funneled through these super PACs and independent expenditures, and it's very hard to follow. But these two races had a lot of money in them with Rauner's money or people that support Governor Rauner. And I think we looked at that race and people thought, okay, if he wins, then this sends a message, Republicans, you better stay on Republican Island and do not stray. Or, maybe he's not as swaying as he believes. And so I think losing these races, saying that taxpayers lost, taxpayers voted in those races.
There was somebody that yelled out the question, aren't these voters taxpayers too? But that was one of the questions the governor kind of didn't hear before he left.
Yeah, he didn't hear that one. But, I think it sends an interesting message that, we asked him, a bunch of the journalists said, is this a rejection of your turnaround agenda? If you can't win a primary, isn't that a rejection? He said no. And he said, and he still insists that his turnaround agenda is popular. But when he talks about the popular points of his turnaround agenda, he's talking about redistricting reform and fair maps and term limits. And he never mentions the collective bargaining or prevailing wages.
He actually did say right to work is
off the table.
No. Well, he said it's off the table, but he also, I think he referred to a Southern Illinois University Paul Simon Policy Institute.
Saying that it's popular.
Yeah, there was. And there were questions about the way the question was worded, but a majority of people did say they want right to work, which is not what's going to happen with our Democratic legislature.
Which is an interesting point, because the governor says, I don't pay attention to polls unless they're in his favor.
Yes, that's true. He always says that when his numbers are down.
Right, so that's an interesting point. But, then I asked him at the press conference, but your union parts of your turnaround agenda, the anti-union parts, are not popular. Like, let's move past it. And he doesn't seem ready to do that. He still seems to think that he has Democrats on his side. I haven't seen any of those Democrats show up to vote. But
he says that. Well, and he says that right to work is off the table, but we know that like the last pension proposal that he put forward says, well, you can't collectively bargain on anything like wages or hours.
Basically everything you collectively bargain on.
Right. And so that's and he says local government should have the opportunity on their own to decide what not to bargain on. And that, again, if you had a Republican legislature like Scott Walker did in Wisconsin, he could get that stuff. I just don't see how he's ever going to get it with an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature.
Yeah,
Andy.
and when you talk about the votes being sort of a rejection, I think Ken Duncan lost by 10,000 votes, and so it was a pretty substantial margin, although in the McCann-Benton race, I think it was more like 2,000. Sometimes it's difficult to interpret sort of the will of the people, or voters can sometimes be fickle, and like you mentioned, asking questions a certain way maybe changes how they feel, and
it was like, well, should you have to join a union
right.
and pay dues if you, or should you have to pay dues if you don't want to join a union? It was some kind of question like
Correct.
that, which didn't exactly say kind of the argument of the people who are against right to work. But anyway.
Right, and I was just going to add, it can be difficult, and I wouldn't necessarily expect the governor to sort of completely change his tune based on legislative primaries, but it's hard to argue that he did not lose in his races.
Well, what's interesting is he also said, basically public policy shouldn't turn on the results of elections. Well, then why are you putting $20 million into your campaign fund at the last possible moment in 2014 before the caps came back on to do this?
Well, I think that's what people rejected. I think they might not have rejected the governor's ideas or his turnaround agenda, but I think some people really did reject the way that those campaigns were run. A lot of dark money, a lot of very negative ads that didn't have to do with substantial issues, but were more character attacks. And I think that might have been what turned people off in this race, that it turned into very dirty politics that most people don't want to participate in when they watch it on TV. They don't want to vote for the guy who's got all the negative ads on TV. So I think that might have been what voters rejected.
Yeah, and we'll just mention the name of Dan Proft again. Somewhere in Chicago, he's probably happy about that, but he's a radio talk show host in Chicago, took 6th place for governor in the 2010 Republican primary, but is a strong voice and has this Liberty Principles PAC that funneled the $3 million, mostly saying Sam McCann is a bad guy. So we'll see where that goes. Also at the State Fair, there was a question from one of the reporters. If you're so in favor of education, Governor, why are you cutting the $1.8 million in ag education, which helps the FFA program in various schools around the state? And his answer was that, well, I don't think we should put it in a line item. We should just give schools the money they're going to get. I'm going to try to give them more money. I'm always want to do that. And let them put it to ag education if they want. And then there was some of the FFA kids who were there, including a guy who was one of the state, Connor Kennedy, I think his name is, he was one of the state officers of that group, said, well, my little high school down in Hardin County, if they get the money, they probably put it into sports, so you need the line item to get it done. It just, I don't know, it was just an interesting, another budget issue where, you know, it looks like he's zeroing something out. He says he's helping, but maybe he's not.
Well, I think he's zeroing something out, but then he's saying, I'm putting more money into education, but he's putting $55 million more into education to reach that foundation level, which is really what the state calls the minimum that each student should be spent on in school districts. And so I don't know how those two arguments really mesh up, because in the end, you have a net cut of money. And we all know that schools are probably not going to put the extra money they get into an extracurricular program. They're probably going to buy the books they can't afford or something else or new technology. So I think having line items forces people to spend that money. And I think the kids in the FFA program who find these programs very important to their futures, they have a right to be upset about something like that.
I should mention that Illinois became the only state in the nation for something within the last week, and that's because there was one other state that had a 9-month budget impasse, Pennsylvania. They have a Democratic governor, Tom Wolf. They've had an impasse because he didn't think the Republican legislature there, so it's kind of the opposite of Illinois, passed a budget that was big enough to adequately fund certain services, but he finally said this last week, I will just let this budget take effect without my veto. So Illinois is now the only state without a budget, at least long term, and this whole 9-month thing is crazy.
To the extent that it does anything substantial with the narrative around here, and I don't know that there's any more kind of narrative damage that can be done for not having a budget, but it sort of reminds me of when we couldn't pay lottery winners, how this is kind of just a big, easy to digest symbol of kind of how things have gotten. And I guess to the extent that it's a crutch, we could say, well, Pennsylvania doesn't have a budget either, but now they do, and Illinois remains the only state now that does not have a budget.
Interesting. Okay, I always say we talk about how people's lives are affected at the beginning of this show, so one effect could be, it's Senator Mulrow, is that correct, wants to increase the price, or the age at which you can purchase cigarettes to 21 from 18 in Illinois. Any chance of that happening? I guess the city of Chicago has done this, so.
And there were several cities, I think, across the country that have done it. The only state that your colleague Drew Zimmerman at the Capitol wrote about having done it was Hawaii. So raising the purchasing age to 21, I think the logic that Senator Mulrow spelled out is sort of, well, we can save money in Medicaid because we won't have so many health problems related to smoking. But then you also have people on the manufacturing side who say the people that come in and buy these things also buy other things, and so we're going to take a hit as well. I think it kind of shows it's not always easy to digest exactly how the the consequences of something like that are going to turn out. I didn't even think of the manufacturers.
Yeah, and I've been at this long enough that I remember cigarettes. Not that I never smoked, but they were very cheap. It was pennies per cigarette, and now, especially in Chicago, with all the taxes that all the different units of government put on, it's all for health. But you keep. I mean, the argument has always been you're driving people to other states and they bring cartons back in their trunk.
And people don't need the daddy state. That's the argument you hear a lot. Let people make their own decisions. If they want to smoke at 18, you're an adult, go buy a pack of cigarettes. You have people on the other side who say, well, you have to be 21 to buy alcohol, and maybe cigarettes are worse than alcohol in some respects. So there's arguments on both sides. I think it's a hot button issue just because it's a good talking point and it affects a lot of people. It's easy to understand.
Yeah.
So we'll
Senator
just see.
Mulrow, has also done things with e-cigarettes as well. So this is sort of
it all makes sense. And I mean, Springfield is home to U.S. Senator Dick Durbin. One of the things he did, I think he was back in his days in the House, he made the push that got cigarettes off airlines because it didn't make much sense that there was a smoking section in the back of the fuselage. And I think the people who work, on the airplanes are pretty happy that changed over time. Into a little more national stuff, the governor finally said last week, and I think it was just an appearance in Chicago, he was asked, could you be for Donald Trump if he is the nominee of the Republican Party? And he said, I will support the nominee of the party. And then somebody said, well, what about Donald Trump? I'm not going to talk about candidates, but I could. So this, of course, opened a little bit of the firestorm yet to come if Donald Trump becomes the nominee in the Republican Party, of people saying Governor Rauner and Senator Kirk, who has also said something similar, he could support the nominee. That's bad.
I think this was maybe shortly after Illinois' primary,
right.
and
It was
Donald
after.
Trump had won
Right.
that primary. It wasn't a full-throated endorsement, as you noted, but I think your former colleague Brian Mackey had a great piece on sort of the similarities between the campaign that Rauner ran and the one that Trump is running now, how it's sort of the CEO politician and why that's seductive.
We won't give in to special interests.
Right.
We'll just run things like a business.
And if you talk to voters, the instinct of just doing something completely different when the view of politics is so negative is powerful. That being said, there are differences, I think, between Rauner and Trump, and that story highlighted many of them. One being that Rauner was a little bit more, he courted the African American community in Chicago, whereas I don't think Trump has had any sort of overt outreach.
And he doesn't generally swear in his
doesn't-
campaign speeches.
Isn't quite, yeah.
Right,
it
very
isn't-
hard not to swear.
Right, isn't quite, as shooting from the hip, perhaps, arguably, but I think that is a helpful sort of heuristic to look at in terms of explaining this election.
Well, I think this is a question that governors across the country and Republicans across the country are going to be getting the closer we get to the nominating process and the longer that Donald Trump stays the front runner, because I think Democrats are going to use it against them. We saw after Governor Rauner made that announcement, the Democratic Congressional Committee actually sent out an email saying we're tracking all of the governors who said that they would support Donald Trump, and so they're going to use it against Republicans. And Senator Mark Kirk's got a very tight race here in Illinois. It's one that's been targeted as one that maybe could flip to Democrats, and so supporting someone like Donald Trump, who is very divisive right now in this political climate, is going to be a good tool for Democrats. The governor could have come out and said, he could have taken the brave stance that some would call it and say, I'm not going to support Donald Trump, which is some of what the Republican establishment is doing right now, but he didn't. And so I think anytime a governor or Republican in the next few months is going to refuse to take that stance, it's going to be used against them at some point.
I will point out, you call it brave, but if the governor of Illinois, a major state, said that, then it becomes national news. And where do you go with that?
Certainly, and by this time, normally a front runner has most of that kind of endorsement locked up. Most members of Congress, most governors in that party are endorsing them. Donald Trump, I think, only has something like 45, 46 members of Congress and governors, and as we've pointed out, they're not exactly strong endorsements.
Yeah, well, it remains to be seen, as Trump and Ted Cruz late in the week have been really fighting over pictures of their wives and who's sniveling this or that. We'll see where that goes. It's very weird. In Illinois, by the way, you mentioned the Mark Kirk race. Tammy Duckworth is the Democratic nominee now for U.S. Senate. There was some kind of meeting in Chicago where some prominent members of the black community said that they were not yet ready to come on board. Andrea Zopp was African American, so was Napoleon Harris, the two other losing candidates in the Democratic primary. So there are some fences to mend, but I'm not sure if, again, I think you're right, Trump may affect the Mark Kirk, Tammy Duckworth race as well if he becomes the nominee, which Ted Cruz promised to a reporter this week that he will not be the nominee, but I'm not sure how the math works. We'll see where that goes. There was a losing candidate for county board in Sangamon County named Joe Bartolomucci who filed some sort of complaint about the lack of ballots that ran out, ballot access, perhaps the number of judges at some polling places that weren't high enough, he thought, in Sangamon County. Any fallout from the Illinois results and the high turnout in this last primary that we've seen?
I read an article just this morning, actually, talking about how people weren't allowed to vote later, and that Attorney General Lisa Madigan really fought against that because it would be unfair and we need to have equality in the voting system. And so the author of the article, who seemed to be very Bernie Sanders sided, said that the Attorney General supported Hillary Clinton in the race, and so of course she would want to do that. The counties where we ran out of ballots, Sangamon County, Bernie Sanders came out on top, and maybe that it was a very tight race, that if these people had access to the ballot, that could have switched. I mean, we could always talk about how it would have affected the race, but I think the more important question is, how do we prepare for the general election and future elections so something like this doesn't happen again? Because clearly there was a lack of preparation in some aspect.
Yeah, well, I know that Sangamon County Clerk Don Gray, who was named to that position when Joe Alia left, was clearly working hard late in the afternoon, and he was, attacked even before the polls closed by Doris Turner, the Democratic county chair in Sangamon, saying, "What's going on?" And I know Don Gray would hope this wouldn't happen again, so we'll find out.
But I think the fact that it happened in other counties besides
That's
Sangamon
right.
County,
He mentioned that
it's
prominently.
not just his fault. I mean, clearly it was mismanagement on many counties. And so looking forward to a general election, I think we need to really be sure that this doesn't happen.
I think they're going to print more ballots. We'll see where that goes. Also, a bit of a feather in Springfield's cap, I guess. There was a statewide tourism conference that came to Springfield. The governor spoke there about what a wonderful industry it is, but then a study came out just as these people started meeting, saying that, well, with state cuts to tourism and with the budget situation the way it is, we could be losing millions and millions of dollars in people coming to visit Illinois and the offshoot industries. So we'll see where it goes. Everything comes down to the budget.
I was going to say on the tourism front, we need some sort of anniversary after the bicentennial, I think, of Lincoln's, the funeral. Or the anniversary of Lincoln. So we need to come up, I think, with another thing.
Well, the state will reach is it 1818? We're coming up on 100 years of 19, 20. Yeah, whatever. There's some.
We're journalists. We're not good at math.
Oh, 2021. So the 200th birthday,
Right.
I guess, of
It's
Illinois, right?
It's coming
yeah.
up.
Okay. We've
And
only
with
got a
that,
few years.
we'll look forward to it. Jordan Abudayyeh, Andy Maloney, thanks for sharing. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.